Reader, come closer. I am here today to talk to you guys about the books that I read in the month of December. Now, I'll already give you a fair warning about my filming schedule, in that I am currently experiencing a little bit of a content creation slump. I think that this is something I get every year around the end of the year, beginning of the new year, and so I'm gonna take it a little bit slow just to avoid to have as much of a gap in content as I did last year around this time period. And so I'm just going to not stress about the content, the schedule as much. So most likely we'll go down to like one video a week. If I'm doing sprints, I might not even do the video that week, for example. So we'll see what ends up happening, but I'm just going to take it a little bit slower in terms of content creation for the coming months in order to avoid just falling off for like 2 entire months the way I did last year. Maybe it was even 3. But let me go and grab my phone, because I actually, and my mother just called me. I guess I have to call her back because I'm supposed to be there in an hour, so there must be a reason why she's calling, right? It was typical mother stuff. It was warning me about the fact that it might be very slippery if I go in through the back the way that I normally come in. But so, without further ado, let's go into the December reading month. I don't think December was an amazing reading month, which is sad because it was sort of like a month in which I decided not to have any plans. Tried my hardest not to make plans for what I would be reading in the month of December, and I still feel like I stuck with certain things for too long, and I maybe didn't always go with my guts about what I wanted to be reading. And yeah, I think I could have still done better in that regards, and that I still had a lot of mediocre reads. But you know, we live and learn. They're not always going to be successful even when you go for spontaneity, and so I hopefully this is just the first month, and we will have a lot of spontaneous months in 2026 that will end up being much better in terms of what I end up reading and my experience with them. But so let me just take the Storygraph stats with me here so that I don't forget a book. Alright, so we have 11 books to go through, which is definitely a fair bit, so I did do quite an extensive amount of reading. So the first thing that I finished in December, and I have the pile here somewhere, is that on that pile? Yep. The first thing that I finished is a book that I, for the majority, read in the month of November, but I did still have a little bit to go in it at the end of, like at the beginning of December, and that is Those Below by Daniel Polanski. He's second in a duology, so this did finish out a series, which I'm very happy with. This was the oldest book on my TBR. It was the one book off of the 2024 haul that I basically had left for the majority of the year, and so this was a book that I was gifted for Christmas. Those Below is the sequel to Those Above, which is a series in which we're looking at basically a world on the brink of revolution. It is a world in which we have Those Above and Those Below. We have these sort of like different race of beings referred to often as the others, who are superior to humans in terms of their strength, and who also consider them superior to humans. They are close to immortal, it almost seems like, or that at least is the opinion, the impression that most people have. And they are basically running this society where humans basically have to abide by their will. The higher ranks of humans are the ranks of humans who are basically servants to these other beings, and the lower levels of human beings are really barely scraping by. And so we're following multiple characters within this world. We're following a soldier who is about to be retired from the field. We are following a being from the lower rungs of society who's basically just scraping by from day to day, drinking to forget his miseries. And then we're following one of these servants of these others. And then we're also following a woman who is in a different part of the world, and for the longest period of time I was very confused with the world building in here, where where her part of the story was taking place. But she's basically in another city that is still part of the dominion of the others. However, they are not like under direct control of the others, and so they don't have direct oversight, and she is living in that world and is part of the political machine of that world, and she will be plotting along the first two books within the series. I mean, the only two books within the series. I did enjoy this one. I wanted to read this one because I have read a short story by Daniel Polanski that was like one of my favorite short stories of all times, which is The Seventh Perfection, or a novella better said. And I do definitely think that I enjoyed the novella way more than I enjoyed this particular series. I do still want to give Daniel Polanski another opportunity, because I do think that he has a really good writing style and interesting ideas. It's just that it didn't fully work for me within this particular series, where I was confused quite a lot of times when it came to the world building, which could be down to me not like correctly latching on to this type of information in the beginning, because I quite often in the series actually don't really pay enough attention to this type of information at the beginning of a series, kind of hoping that as things go along I'll kind of catch up more to world building and to all the terminology that's thrown at you at the beginning of a fantasy book, and that doesn't always pan out. And in this case it also didn't really pan out, because I was confused more than I should have been for a long period of time. The next thing I picked up was Network Effect by Martha Wells. This is the fifth, I think, fifth book in the Murderbot Diaries series, and this is the first sort of like full-length novel within those, because the majority of those books were novellas. So Murderbot is a series in which we're looking at a robot who has basically hacked his government module, so he's no longer under the control of the people who hire him for assignments. However, he uses his newfound freedom not to kill and destroy or run away. He uses it to basically just watch all the entertainment that he wants, because he sees that like the easiest way for him to fly under the radar is to just keep on doing what people tell him to do, but on his spare time enjoy it as much as possible. And he is sent off on a mission together with a crew, and the mission definitely goes a little bit awry. This also has not a Netflix, this has a Amazon adaptation, and I watched the first series of that and definitely did enjoy it. And so this fifth book, I cannot really talk too much about it. Most of the stories have been kind of isolated from each other, not fully of course, because it's always following Murderbot, and there are references to the previous stories happening throughout, but this is definitely also the point, I feel like, where we're starting to see connections. We are meeting up with the crew that we have from the first book, and a character from the second book is also involved within this story, so we're starting to make more connections within the series at this point in time. I think the next book is the final one that I need to reread, and then I will be up to date on where I was to continue along. And hopefully this time around I have grasped more of the world, because basically that's why I decided to reread rather than continue, is because I started to feel like I had been treating most of these stories as sort of like isolated stories, but the further along you get into the series, the more it's building off of elements that come from the first few installments and elements that I had completely forgotten about. Next up, I read the winner of the Man Booker Prize. I read Flesh by David Saleh, and this book, I will say, like, after having read this book, I didn't necessarily have the feeling of like, whoa, this is the best book of the year. I totally get it, but I definitely had a good time with this book, which I cannot say for all the Man Booker Prize books. So this is a book in which we're following a Hungarian man, but most of the time we'll be actually spending in London. We see him through different snippets of time, and actually the structure is probably what I most enjoyed about it, because it's mainly like we're always starting our chapter at a certain point in time, and then we are following him from that moment on in a more sort of like organic manner that you see in most of the books that you read. However, every time a new chapter starts, there will have been some sort of a time jump, and you basically have to resettle in this sort of like perspective to kind of see what has changed in the meantime, and to glean clues from the things that are being mentioned in order to fill in the gaps between time. And so this allows for this book to very much be sort of like hyper focused on the present moment, but still have a lot of time pass by in the course of a not super long novel. And this book very much will look at basically the character is sort of a guy who's seen as this sort of like alpha male to some extent. He is a strong, busky little guy who is not open about his feelings, is not open in his communication about what he's feeling, but through his perspective we see the internal struggle of him and his emotions. He definitely to some extent is a modern man in the sense of him going to therapy, for example, and going to therapy in a past time frame, but it's a lot about that, about navigating the image of what it is to be a man and the reality of you know, maybe not necessarily fitting that particular mold or that particular expectation. And so he at some point will go over to London, where he will find employment and will start a relationship with the wife of his employer. And it's a lot about the sort of like tensions within that situation and tensions that lead on from there, but also tensions about him not being a Brit and being a foreigner within English society. And yeah, I thought I definitely thought it was interesting. It was a book that kept me engaged throughout, in spite of me not being able to really talk much about things that happened, because it isn't really about the events taking place. It is, and on some level it is very low scale, very internal, without necessarily only being focused on the internal aspect of this character. But so yes, as indicated, I enjoyed this book. I thought it was interesting. I liked the structure of following the character through these sort of like flashes of his life. And yeah, I definitely by the end, because with this book I had the instance that I lost my library loan like 30 minutes before the book ended, and I definitely needed to know the end. You know, it was not a book where I could have like left off the ending, or you know, where I could have waited for the ending a little bit longer, because there was definitely some tension built up in a certain relationship that I wanted to see how that was going to get resolved in the end. Then we have a book that I DNF'd, unfortunately, because it is also a special edition. This is the first book in the Broken Binding Sci-Fi and Fantasy subscription, which is a new subscription that they started at the end of 2025, in which they will be sending new releases in sci-fi and fantasy genre. They have 2 books out so far. I did skip the second book. I am getting the third one this month still, I think, and so it's currently bi-monthly, but it will become monthly at some point in 2026. So, Crossroads of Ravens, the prequel to The Witcher by Andrzej Sapkowski. It didn't work for me. Now, I knew for years already that there is some sort of like problem that many people have with the writing style, and I had that as well. I definitely didn't really get along with the writing style at all, and I did try to switch to the Dutch audiobook for this, on the one hand as a way to kind of get me through the pages, because I was just not getting through the pages. It was really a struggle and a slog for me to get through these pages. And then and because this is a translation from Polish, I switched to the Dutch audiobook in the hopes that maybe the Dutch translation would work better for me. But Dutch translations are always a hurdle or a danger for a Flemish speaker like me, because they are very often in a very clear Dutch from the Netherlands accents, using Dutch from the Netherlands structures and vocabulary, and that can really take me out of it, especially when it concerns a fantasy novel like this. And it was also using a type of vocabulary that I just don't think belongs in a fantasy novel, like, you know, just like informal references to children that are so modern day, which totally clashes with this medieval fantasy world setting. So yeah, I just could not deal with the audiobook neither. So Crossers of Ravens is basically the origin story of Geralt of Rivia, which is the character that you follow throughout the Witcher series. If you have seen the TV show or the game, that's also Geralt that we're following there. And he's basically a Witcher, which means that he has some sort of a power that not all humans have, and that he can use those powers to destroy demons. And so we're following here as he's just graduated from the academy, and basically he's taking on different appointments, different requests for monster hunting. Now, this is set up as a full story, but it definitely read more like a collection of short stories, because there is an overarching plot that starts in the beginning and that probably will conclude in the end, but I only got halfway through this one. But a lot of the times we see him just like roaming around, and then there's a notice of somebody needing a witcher. He goes over to that location and then he helps these people out, and we move on to the next assignment. And so that didn't really work for me. I needed more of an overarching plot, or I needed more interest in the overarching plot, because there is some scheming that seems to be going on over there, but I didn't have enough of an interest in watching that unfold, considering how much difficulty I had getting through the quests because of the writing style just really not working for me. The writing style is very sec, very much just sort of like giving you the facts, no insight into the Witcher and his feelings about the things that he's taking on, and that also resulted in some annoyance on my end when it came to questionable content, because, you know, as there's no sort of like reflection made on things said or done. Like at one point he kind of helps this maiden who was about to be violated, and like we can expect from those actions that means that he doesn't approve of these things, but there are some things said about women that are very misogynistic that we don't really get an answer to or reflection on about how he feels about people using this type of language. And that just made it annoying for me, because, you know, like there was quite a lot of misogynistic language in this and nothing was ever said about it, making me think that this is just like humor that the author wanted to inject into it, and that he is actually okay with this language, because there's no clue to it being differently. But aside from that, as indicated, it's just so sec that I just couldn't get through it. It just, like, it never appealed to me to continue, and so that's why it's put on the audiobook in the hope that, you know, that would just like continue without me having to put much of an effort into it. But because I only had access to the Dutch audiobook, that didn't end up working because of the reasons that I've already explained. Next up, I listened to an audiobook called Mistletoe and Mayhem at a Little Shopping Mall by Hannah Pearl. This is a Christmas book, so with the lead up to Christmas I decided I wanted to consume some Christmas stories, because I don't typically tend to do that, and every year I'm like, oh, I wish I could indulge in these types of stories, but I always have so much on my TBR that I don't end up doing it. And so this year I wanted to do some, and I must admit that I'm not actually sure that is successful for me. Not exactly sure that I like Christmas books all that much, but, you know, I had an okay time with some of them. In Mistletoe and Mayhem at the Little Shopping Mall, in this book we are following a woman who is basically, she's like a young adult, but she's had to take care of her brother from a young age because their parents passed away. Basically, their parents were working in this particular shopping mall as well, and so the people who have been stall owners in the shopping mall for a very long time are basically sort of like their second family. And now, since a few months, there's a new owner or a new manager of the shopping mall, but he seems to be avoiding a lot of his responsibilities and putting a lot of those responsibilities on our protagonist's shoulders. But she's still okay with that. Things are going along quite well. However, there's a new stall holder who has basically been given a I don't know, an office, that's not how I want to call it, a shop within this shopping mall, and things do not go very well with him, and tensions are also high because he's actually a friend of the manager who is above her. Simultaneously, around that same time, she also notices some guy who seems to be stalking this new shop, and it turns out that he's a police officer who thinks that the owner of that particular shop is involved in a past crime, and so potentially is now performing some criminal activity. And so she will kind of help him along in his investigation, and feelings develop along the way. I thought it was just fine. Like, I typically don't really like a detective style story, but when it isn't about like finding out who done it, I do not mind it as much. So in this case, it isn't necessarily, it's not a who done it, it is a what's been done or something, whatever, you know. We know who we're keeping an eye on, we just need to figure out what he's actually up to. And I did really enjoy that. I did definitely think that there's like the gimmick of kind of getting this police officer bare-chested as often as possible was kind of stale by the end of it, and the police officer aspect, I also found it to be a little bit of a red flag for a lot of the book, because he never really shows like a badge or any type of authentication to confirm the fact that he is an actual police officer. They're never in contact with any other police force throughout this book, and so I definitely for quite a while was wondering whether he was actually a bad guy and she was actually just being misled, and we would have another romantic interest come in at some point in time. But so yeah, I got along with this book okay, but it was also not like a new favorite, or it didn't necessarily fill me with all of the holiday cheer that I was looking for in a book like this, because even though it's called Mistletoe and Mayhem, it doesn't actually feature Christmas all that much. The Christmas period does come in towards the end of this book, but it's definitely very focused on the plot line of what I've just explained. Then I re-listened to Emma by Jane Austen. So I did this to myself to choose a Jane Austen that was not going to be as successful, so we can also blame myself for those choices. But on the 16th of December was the 250th birthday of Jane Austen, and so I wanted to celebrate by starting my Jane Austen puzzle while listening to a Jane Austen audiobook, and I decided last minute to choose Emma, because Emma is my least favorite Jane Austen heroine. I find her very obnoxious and I don't like reading about her, and even though I don't like the character of Emma, I even less like to read about her starting to realize how obnoxious of a character she is, and the downfall that comes towards the end of this book. Now, I did enjoy kind of re-experiencing the story, re-evaluating it, seeing like worth in it that I hadn't previously seen. Not to say that before I was like, what a piece of trash, but kind of, you know, like focusing on other things. I went into this very much knowing that the character of Emma is a character that I cannot stand, and so kind of latching onto other stuff within the book, or kind of being more removed from an observation of Emma the character herself, because I already knew my opinion about her and I already knew some of the stuff that she gets up to. But I would still say that, like, if I didn't have an amazing time with this book, I went into that knowing that, and so it is also my own choice to not choose the best experience for myself by just rereading Persuasion or Jane Austen, not Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, because those two would have definitely given me a much better experience and would have led to a higher rating for the month of December. Next up, I also listened to The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny by Kieran Desai. So this is another Booker Prize book, and this unfortunately is a Booker Prize book that I basically kind of went through the motions with. I was very hopeful for a different turn of events, and the beginning of this book definitely did intrigue me a lot, but I just got more and more lost along the way, to the point where I feel that towards the end I was almost just like listening but not really paying attention anymore. In this book, we are following two characters, Sonia and Sunny, who are both kind of children of Indian families who have been kind of not always raised. In the case of Sunny, he's basically been raised with like the US in mind, basically been raised as an expat almost. And Sonia, also at the beginning of this novel, is also living in the US, as is Sunny, and so she's also a foreigner living in the US, and also a little bit of an outsider when they go back to India. And so Sonia is feeling very lonely, however, in the US. Sunny seems to be getting along with the US climate a lot better, but Sonia is definitely definitely feeling very lonely until she meets this certain character, and the bond between these two characters, like between Sonia and the guy that she meets, will kind of determine the whole of this story and the later developments within this book, because even when she gets away from this rather questionable violent relationship, the ghost of him will keep on haunting her throughout this book. And so yeah, I was rooting for these characters, but I definitely feel like along the way it just took too long, took too many detours, too many deviations for me to be fully engaged with the story anymore. So towards the end, I wasn't really paying all that much attention anymore, unfortunately. Next up, we have arrived at Christmas Day, because we have arrived at me finishing my Advent calendar book, which is A Heart for Christmas by Sophie Germain. So this is a translated book from French. This is one that you have to basically like open a chapter for every single day of the month of December until you get to the 25th and the conclusion of this novel. I definitely did enjoy this book. This one gets super bad ratings. A lot of people saying like it's written for like a 5-year-old child or something like that, but it is young adult. But in any case, I feel like I never expected this book to be a literary highlight or something like that. I just expected a cozy, fun little story for the holidays, and that is definitely what I got. Because we are looking at a young girl who's had a heart transplant 2 years ago, I think at that point in time, who is going to spend some time with her father during the Christmas period. And so her father lives somewhere in the south of France, I think, close to the Alps, I guess, at a sort of like ski resort. She used to love skiing, however, since her heart transplant, she's basically living off of borrowed time. She has to make sure that this heart goes along with her as long as possible. So she's very careful about what she's eating, what she's doing, and she is very eager to also kind of get away from her overprotective mother, who definitely keeps a tight leash on these things. And so she is, on the one hand, very conscientious on her own side and very scared of doing something wrong and ending up having to like dying, of course, or having to have another heart transplant at such a young age, but also a wish to kind of re-indulge in some of those past experiences. And during her time with her father there, she will also re-examine her relationship with somebody from her past, somebody who she's never seen in that particular light. So I loved the focus on a character with such a medical history and focusing on this disability and on her kind of overcoming fears, navigating her reality now, but not necessarily letting that new reality hold her back to such a strong extent that it had been doing before, kind of re-navigating what is possible, trying to basically indulge in some of those things that, you know, strictly speaking, could be bad for her, but if you never indulge in those things, then you're also not really living a life anymore. If you never allow yourself to have fun, because the fun could potentially lead to something bad, even though it could also not. If you're always going to stop yourself from doing the things you want to do because there could be something bad that comes out of it, then you are just constantly living in fear, and that is also not a good way to live. And especially when it comes to a heart condition, living in fear, I think, would also probably not be that great. But so I loved that focus of the book. I loved getting to navigate that and seeing the people around her, kind of the different opinions of the people around her, because originally sort of her parents are sort of like the polar opposites of one another, you know. The mother is super conscientious about every single risk to her daughter's health, and the father is much more laid back. But definitely as we get further along in the book, we see that the father definitely also has his worries. He's just, compared to the mother, way more laid back. And then we get their parents to some extent also gets this sort of like impression that their daughter is going like too far when she starts to live a little more and take some risks. And just live, and just indulge in some things that aren't necessarily like the ideal things to be indulging in when you have a condition like that. But so, I enjoyed it. I liked the romance in this one. I also like that we see a sort of like friend dynamic here that I don't think we necessarily see all too often in literature neither. I won't go into that because that is spoiler territory, but I did like experiencing that within the book as well. So yeah, for me it was pretty okay. I mean, it's not like an amazing read. I still gave it probably like 3 stars, so something middle of the road. But I definitely didn't struggle with it, and I definitely thought that, like, in terms of an advent calendar book in which you're reading 1 chapter a day, it was sort of like the ideal level of engagement. You also don't want it to be so good that you are like annoyed that you have to wait until the next day to read another chapter in it. Or I didn't really want it to be that way in any case. This happened occasionally, of course. Occasionally I would read a chapter for that day and want to go to the next day. But if you're gonna have that like 25 days in a row, then that also seems like a torture of an advent calendar rather than a joy. And then we have 3 more books to go through. So I received a book for Christmas and instantly read it, and that is The Christmas Tree That Loved to Dance by Miranda Hart. So this is a children's book set around the Christmas time period. Our protagonist is sort of this woman who's very clumsy, a lot of clumsy you know, sort of like cringe things happen to her throughout this book, but she has the ability to kind of read the thoughts of her dog, for example, but also of Christmas trees. And so one morning she is walking out after the Christmas period, and all of these discarded Christmas trees are lying around at the side of the road, and one of them kind of talks to her, and so she tries to rescue it from the people who are there to collect Christmas trees, and mayhem ensues as a result of this. I thought it was fun, it was endearing, and as I said, it's like she has a lot of these cringe moments that happen to her, kind of like the character of Miranda. But so yes, it was fun and, you know, like a light read for the holiday periods. Next up, I read a big success for the end of the year, which is The Everlasting by Alex E. Harrow. And this is a big success that didn't start out as a big success. This is a book that I mainly associate with London because a lot of the pages that were a success I read when I was in London. So in The Everlasting, we are basically following one particular character who is a scholar who is examining the time period in which the origin myths of the realm basically were established. And the origin myths are all about this knight called Una Everlasting, who played a pivotal role in getting the queen in power at that point in time. Now, this scholar receives a book at some point in time, and this book is a new version of the stories of Una Everlasting, a version she has never heard of, a version she didn't know existed at all. However, when she leaves the book for a little bit and returns to her flat, the book is missing, and there's a note in there asking her to go to a certain address at a certain point in time. I'm saying she, but it's actually he. And then he goes to this particular place where he's basically given the opportunity to travel back in time to the time of Una Everlasting and meet the knight herself. Now, this is a time loop novel. I went into that knowing that, and it's a good thing that I knew that because I love that element. And I must say that the first sort of trip back in time takes the longest and was a little bit more of a struggle for me because it is a lot about the mutual pining between the scholar and the knight, and that is not something that, you know, intrigues me, interests me. I'm not pulled away from romantic pining, but it's not what I want my main focus to be in a book, and that first section definitely felt like that. But basically we will go through different loops of the same events, seeing certain things change, basically trying to avoid the loop, trying to escape the loop, which is always what I love the most about time loop novels. And definitely by the end of it, I was completely engrossed and absolutely loved this book. So I will say that if you're not enjoying yourself with the first 2 sections, the first Death of Una Everlasting and the second Death of Una Everlasting, then give it give it a chance to get to that third loop, and that's when things turned around for me. That was also kind of why I kept on going in it, because I knew that if the time loop element was going to become more prominent, then I would probably start to eat this book up, and that is definitely what happened around that third loop. But so yes, I cannot really say too much about this, but this is also a book that very much talks about a theme that I love, which is history and how history is written by the winner. And basically what we're seeing within this book is a winner desperately trying to write the best story possible, to write the ultimate origin myth. So yeah, I love this story a whole lot, and it will definitely live in my mind for quite a while. And then the final thing that I finished in 2025 was The Penguin Lessons by Tom Michel, and this was a little bit of a disappointment. I've had it on my want to read for quite a long time, and the movie has just come out. I wanted to read the book in order to see the movie. Then when I was going to see the movie with my friend called off the movie visit, and then the next 2 days is when it started to become really bad weather over here, and so I didn't make it to the cinema for this particular movie. But I was also less interested at that point in time to kind of like, if the book had been amazing, I would probably have still gone through the bad weather of Monday or Tuesday to go and see it. But because the book had been somewhat disappointing, I didn't necessarily mind skipping the movie at that point in time. But so, this is a book about a British guy who is basically working in Argentina in some boarding school teaching English over there, and on a holiday to Uruguay, he stumbles upon a beach full of penguins that have basically died there because of an oil spill. However, one of them appears to still be alive, and so he kind of cleans up this penguin and takes him back to Argentina with him, where he will basically be living alongside him, because the penguin seems to have no interest in leaving this guy and returning into the wild, and so we follow their adventures and sort of like the impact that the penguin has on both him and the kids at the school. Ultimately, I just felt a little bit disappointed when I got towards the end of this book. Like I just ended up feeling like it was okay when I had expected it to be amazing. So it was a case of me having very high expectations and the book not necessarily being able to match those expectations. I definitely still think it was a wholesome read and an amazing story to hear about, but it was just not a 5-star read where I was going into it expecting that. So if you just want a wholesome little story about the relationship between this penguin and the people around him, and the lessons that people can learn from a penguin, then go and check this book out, because then you will definitely be able to have a good time with this book. But so yeah, that is my December reading. On the screen there will be a graph of my December reading. The only thing that I'm pretty sure is that probably the TBR at start and TBR at end information is gonna be not that positive because I think I went into the month with 12 books, right? And I ended with 19, so maybe I went even in with less that I'm not entirely sure of. But yeah, this was definitely a month in which some books got added to the TBR. Like I knew, of course, that books were gonna get added to the TBR because hello Christmas. But initially my plan had been to keep things under wraps a little bit, but then in the end I was like, you know what? I'm gonna be spending one of the final days of the year in London. I don't want to not buy anything there for on that day just to go into 2026 with a lower number, because I knew that the number was already ruined by Christmas in any case. So I was like, you know what, let's just say, let's put a new threshold. In any case, the decision to go into 2026 with less than I had gone into 2025 with was pretty much a last minute decision. So I was more than happy to let go of that expectation, and we'll see, because basically the reason why I wanted to go into 2026 with a lower amount of books than I went into 2025 with was because I had been stringing some of these books from 2024 along for such a long period of time. as evidenced by the fact that the last 2024 book is in this December wrap-up. I just think that if in 2026 we get through these books just a little bit quicker, then I'll feel very differently about the number that I went into 2026 with. It's not necessarily about the number, it is just about not stringing those books along for the entire year, because I want this year to be the year of spontaneity, and I feel like carrying some of these books with me for a long period of time might hinder that, because if we get to the point in the year in which I've got like 5 TBR books from 2025 still to get through, then that will just make me feel like, okay, I have to prioritize these books, I have to pick these books up to now, and we'll get back into that type of mental game. But we'll see, because for the first few months of the year we are relatively at ease. The oldest book, my TBR, is from April or May of 2025, and then I think the next one is from August. So we definitely do have a lot of leeway in the beginning of the year. Hopefully I'll be picking up some books from my TBR along the way as well, to avoid getting to the point where we have to prioritize some of them. And I've definitely already been tackling a fair few books that were recently added to the TBR at this point in time, and it's not even mid-January yet. So yeah, with that, I am ending my December wrap-up. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and see you guys for the next one. Bye!